So, hello everyone. I'm Boots Dunlap, the CEO and co-founder of RRA Capital, an institutional investment manager solely focused on commercial real estate finance. We have approximately 450 million in AUM, and it's my privilege today to host this quarterly conversation with Stephen Paintner. The quarterly conversations are research calls that we do on topics that we're watching closely and want to better understand. Oftentimes, these topics are new trends in commercial real estate that we use to inform our investment decision so that we can get ahead of cycles within product types. Being early to identify these cycles has been one of the largest generators of alpha in our investment strategy. And one of the trends that have been most closely watched is the emerging opportunity set in office conversions. So our team set out to talk with one person in the world that has more experience in this strategy than any other human alive. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, he is an architect and not an investor. But he has worked on more office conversions than possibly any other human alive. Stephen Paintner is the global practice leader of building transformation at Gensler. For those who aren't familiar with Gensler, it's one of the largest architecture firms. And it's around the world with 53 offices and projects in over 100 countries. To quickly explain how Stephen became the world expert on the subject. So Stephen is based in Calgary. And for those that don't know, the main industry in Calgary has long been energy. And when the oil sands crisis happened roughly 10 years ago or so, the office market was hit pretty hard. So going into COVID, the office market in Calgary had almost 40% vacancy just due to the oil sands recession. So through this process, there was a lot of conversions that happened, and he actually helped Calgary structure incentives and then developers work on converting a lot of product there, getting ahead of sort of the conversions that we're in now today, post-COVID, and sort of the modern work remote environment. He also developed the most extensive algorithm and software program that I believe is available, which quickly assesses conversion feasibility of office to multifamily. He's worked on numerous office to multifamily conversions around the world, not just the US. He's advised not just Calgary, but he advised Chicago on the incentives that they created for conversion of office to multifamily. He's advised Mayor Adams in New York City on it, San Francisco, San Diego, Denver, you name the cities. He's been involved in helping them craft incentives in order to help create the catalyst for these transformations. He's been the advisor to the Biden-Harris administration and to HUD on helping them solve the housing crisis through creating incentives around these office conversions. And he studied the carbon impact of converting existing office as opposed to building new apartments, which ends up producing less carbon to recycle the existing real estate. And he's probably worked on more projects than any other architect, and is currently working on projects converting office to multifamily all across the US. So there's a lot of folks out there that in our industry that believe that converting office to multifamily is not economical. They believe it's not functionally feasible. This is a popular thing to say, particularly if you're the salty old lender or developer. We hear these complaints, not these complaints, we hear these concerns and these arguments about how it's not feasible or possible all the time. And probably no one hears them more than Stephen. So I challenge Stephen, and I also challenge the audience. You have the ability to write in questions at any point, but to address some of the common complaints that you hear, Stephen, on how people say that this is not feasible or economical, and then why they're wrong. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Stephen Paintner, who I'm honored to have is our guest on today's quarterly conversation.
Well, thanks very much. It was quite the introduction. So I'm going to kind of run through a lot of the work we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years, and especially the approach we've developed to figuring out which buildings work, which locations work, and why. Obviously, that's the important question. And also some of the incentive programs that we've been working with. We've different cities, as Boots said, the work we've been doing in Calgary, but also across the US. As we go through today, there is a Q&A chat box. I know Sarah's pre-populated it with some of the questions that we've already had, but please feel free to put questions in as we go, and I will try and answer them within the flow of the conversation. But if I don't get to them, I will get to them at the end, or happy to follow up with people as well. It's obviously much easier to answer, to see the questions during the same slides are still on the screen. So I will start sharing my screen and we can get stuck into it. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see. Zoom likes to pop screens up all over the place. So I assume, Boots, you can see what's going on. We're good. All right, perfect. So as we kind of alluded to in the introduction, we've been working on this particular approach to conversion for quite some time, but we really started actually almost exactly this time of year in 2019. And we were at, every year we do this partners meeting for Gensler in LA, and we all sat there in 2019 and were told by our CFO that there's a recession coming, and that we should go figure out what to do. So the first thing we do when we get warned or something like that is go and talk to our clients, to developers, to lenders, to landlords, and say, what are you worried about? If something goes wrong in the next 6 months, where's your fear? And almost all of them, you remember this is pre-COVID, almost all of them came back and said they were really worried about their Class C office assets, particularly in weaker markets, Calgary being a good example, but across the US as well. And especially the ones they'd reinvested in. A lot of people were reinvesting to upgrade the buildings, to add amenities and so on, but they weren't seeing the payoff. We started looking at it, we started thinking about that and a few other things. And then fast forward to April and May 2020, and all of a sudden people were really panicked about this topic. But luckily we'd got a kind of head start on it and started thinking about how we could change the way people approach them. And a big part of it was this, as Boots said, we started this work in Calgary, but pre-COVID, Calgary had a 38% vacancy. And that was really down to the oil industry. But other cities were seeing the same thing. And actually now, post-COVID, you're seeing it the same or worse in other cities too. And you can actually see, one of the questions is which cities are prime for this type of conversion. It really is those kind of mono-use cities that rely on a single industry. So you're seeing places like Dallas and Houston here with super high vacancy, same with Phoenix. But that's true of other kind of cities. And weirdly, some of the first conversions that were done pre-pandemic were in Kansas City, which was relying heavily on the greeting cards kind of hallmark industry. And when that closed down, they saw a lot of vacancy. So cities that have that kind of mono-use or monoculture in their downtown really prime for this type of thing happening. And then it really, what brought this into sharp focus over the last 6 months is stats like this, that about 7% of all commercial real estate backed loans are going to default. And that number has been creeping up gradually, but it is now, between now and Christmas, it's about $6 billion worth of loans, but it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars next year. And that really is enough to cause huge disruption in our collective industry, but also cause disruption at a kind of national level. And you're starting to see that with the collapse of banks as well. And everyone knows, Signature Bank collapsed. Currently, they're auctioning off their core office assets, and that was a big part of the problem there. And then we started trying to get clever about what kind of buildings, and this is a stat that particularly worries me, that the vacancy in newer buildings, and by new buildings I mean post 2008, or slightly older, is staying pretty good, but the value and occupancy in pre-2008 buildings is dropping off pretty severely. And I was designing buildings in 2008. I wouldn't necessarily count them as old, but they are really starting to struggle as well. And for our developer clients and our landlord clients, a big part of it was this concept that they needed during COVID and post-COVID to diversify their holding. They were primarily 70% office, and this is actually a developer working with an international developer, but based in Toronto. And they're looking to diversify their holding from primarily office to a more balanced mix, basically in the same way that you diversify your pension or your investments yourself. Owners and developers weren't doing that, and now they've really realized the reason they need to. At the moment, it's very difficult to sell office. So if you can't sell it, then converting it is a good way of diversifying, of course. And again, getting kind of accurate or getting really fine-tuned on the types of buildings. We've been looking at not just leasing data, which is shown here, but also cell phone data on where people are going and what buildings they're actively using. Now, leasing is a part of that because we're already seeing vacancy in certain building types increase. And when you see those average vacancies in slides like this, well, that's kind of hiding is that a 17% average vacancy means you probably got 35 to 40% vacancy in Class C and maybe 10 in Class A. But it also became super location specific. So you're seeing on this image on the screen here, the leasing data for trophy class buildings, so top 10% of the market in Manhattan. The leasing is still going pretty well. The vacancy is pretty low. But Class C buildings, the bottom 30%, so 3 times as many assets on the right here. The only locations that were leasing were right on primary transit. And actually, the Toronto School of Cities did a really interesting cell phone mapping study, which basically revealed the same thing. That despite any return to office self-reported numbers that you're seeing or anything like that, the cell phone data, so actual numbers of actual people in those locations, was tracking the same way. They were in high quality neighborhoods, in Class A buildings and trophy class buildings, and not in C class buildings unless they're right on transit. So that idea of flight to quality or earning the commute is really driving the studies that we're now doing to identify which buildings are primed for conversion and which aren't. So as I said, this started in Calgary because they basically had a 10-year head start on the vacancy problem. And they approached us in late 2020 and said, hey, we've seen some studies that you've been doing on how to determine which buildings work and which don't work for conversion. Can you look at our entire downtown and tell us which buildings could be converted just on a typical cost basis, and then what we'd have to do to increase that to get rid of half of our vacancy? And that's something that we're seeing pretty commonly now amongst the cities that we're working with. And Boots mentioned a few in the introduction. We've actually done about 20 cities now that we've worked with to do these studies to see how they could bring vibrancy back to their cities. And they're all looking at about half of their vacancy. So can you convert 7% or 10% of the office market to remove that increase in vacancy we've seen over COVID? For Calgary, the problem is obviously pretty significant. They had 14 million square feet of vacancy in a pretty small city. So they need to figure out how to get rid of 7 million roughly. And their property tax had gone down by 63% because they'd, since 2015, lost $17 billion worth of value in the downtown. Now, as I said, they had a head start, for better or worse, about 10-year head start on this trend. But we're seeing that in other cities now, losing a huge amount of revenue, a huge amount of tax base. And Calgary wanted to reinvest. They wanted to put money in to build that tax base back up. So we kept it pretty simple for them. Actually, we developed an approach. We went through all of the buildings in downtown, and I'll show you how we did that in a second. And we came up with about 3 million square feet that could easily be converted, just would work from a market point of view. And then we looked at the next kind of 4 million square feet and said, what do you need to do to make those viable? And the answer was actually pretty simple. You needed to inject about $75 a square foot of cash into those projects to make them happen. To my, honestly, absolute surprise, when we said that to the city, we said $75 a square foot, it's going to cost you about $200 million to make this happen. But we think the return is there, the tax base will go up, you'll get the money back in less than 5 years. They just said, sure, that sounds good. And they've literally made it this simple. There's 4 bullet points on the screen right now, but they're doing a $75 square foot incentive program. You get a letter of credit once you've been accepted into the program, which you can use to borrow against. And then you get the money on occupancy of the building. They've been flexible on the code, although that's not actually been a massive driver. And they've got the approvals timeline down to about 4 weeks. So from design to construction in about 4 weeks, which is absolutely incredible. I sit in Toronto and it takes about 18 months to 2 years to get a project approved here. So very jealous of the work that we're doing in Calgary for that reason. And this had a huge impact. They have 5 buildings that are already under construction, nearly completed, and another 10 buildings approved through the system, which are starting construction over the next few months. And that combined impact is going to create about 24% higher population in their downtown core. So it doesn't sound like a lot of buildings, 15, but it's a small city, and it's going to make a massive change and really deal with some of the housing crisis issues that they've had. The work we're now doing with other cities has a similar impact, although every other city that we've worked with since have tried to make it more complicated than just here's some money, get it done. And you're seeing things like in the Chicago system, it's a mixture of tax increment financing, low interest rate borrowing, and some incentives. Other cities doing similar things as well. But one of the critical parts of it is not just creating the new homes, creating that new investment in the downtown. It's also creating vibrancy in the neighborhoods. So you can see here that Calgary have kind of grouped some of their projects together. So you start getting enough people to create viable ground floor retail spaces that are going to open on the weekend, viability for restaurants and grocery stores and so on. And they've actually started tying in acceptance into the program to having certain tenants in some cases as well. So, can you get a grocery store in your ground floor? Then you'll get some extra incentives to do that. And we've also been trying to take this to a much higher level. So this is a slightly awful picture of me at the White House. Believe it or not, they did let us take pictures in there. But I was there with a small group of real estate professionals to help talk about what is needed to create more housing. And out of that came the Biden-Harris action plan for lower cost housing. And one of the 3 bullet points that they highlighted in there is promoting conversion projects, particularly to lower carbon emissions. And we're already starting to see money flow from that program through low interest borrowing for construction and through some of the money that HUD is starting to put out for creation of new housing units. So we're trying to tackle it not just from the architecture side of things, but also, get money moving, because that's been a huge problem recently, and get federal and state and city investment into it to take the barriers out of the way as well. So that's the kind of preface. That's what we've been doing, and we're now kind of getting into how we scale that up. How do we do not just a few buildings a year, but how do we do hundreds of buildings a year? And that's really what led us to this approach of developing an algorithm. The idea of the algorithm was to get away from design paralysis or decision paralysis, which is really impacting some of these projects. A lot of people just kind of slightly scared and not sure if it's going to work. So how do we give them robust data to make a decision? And how do we help them move more quickly? And first mover advantage might have disappeared a little bit because we've already got some projects completed, but it's still a big driver. A good example of this was talking with a client at a conference last week. They actually had a project ready to go. They went out for financing, and it took them about 9 months of negotiations with the same investor to get the financing in place because they were just a bit scared to make a decision. During that period, the cost of financing went up about 3%. So that, that decision paralysis is critical. Right now, the more direct you can be with your decisions, the more chance you have of success. So this is how the algorithm works. And again, this was originally built around Calgary. We've now expanded it to take in every major city in the world and have specific data for those cities as well.
And I'm going to
But
interrupt real quickly, Stephen. There's some people that
yeah,
are posing questions, and what we'll do is we'll answer those questions at the end. And I have been advised, we saw some of these questions in advance. I do know Stephen is aware of some of the ones that were sent in, so he has
yeah, the ones in advance,
he's,
so I'll
he's
kind of get
tackling a
to.
lot of them. So
Yeah,
some of those questions might be answered through this presentation. The rest will tackle
yeah,
at the end, but keep sending them in. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. And just to answer them specifically, we are just starting to see C-PACE financing come into these projects. I'd say it's happened over the last 3 months. So not projects that are built, but they are now starting to happen. That seems to be a good market for getting finances for these at the moment. And the Calgary deal doesn't have any affordable housing component. The approach to affordable housing is a little bit different in Canada generally, but there is a drive to create more units in the market and have that slow the increase in rent to a greater or lesser extent. What we've seen in cities like New York, where they did try and attach an affordable component with originally an 80% AMI, and then someone pushed for a 40% AMI, but it actually just sank the entire deal. Like developers came back in and said, what you're offering as a tax abatement does not pay for the 80% AMI affordable housing requirement. So we're not going to take the tax abatement. We're going to do the projects without you. And that kind of killed what Mayor Adams was trying to do there. They're now trying again for a new system, for the new legislative period. But if there is going to be affordable housing requirements, as we are seeing cities like San Francisco and Toronto and Montreal, it really has to be backed with enough incentive to make it valuable for the developers to do it. Otherwise, they just really won't be interested. So as I was saying, Calgary gave us about 3 weeks to analyze 14 million square feet of vacancy. So the only real way to do that was to create a system that did it for us. So we came up with this idea of an algorithm, and that is really based on the fact that everything to do with residential real estate or residential development is numbers. It's unit size, unit mix, floor plate efficiency, elevator ratio, parking ratio, et cetera, et cetera. And, architects like me come in and dress that up and make it pretty. But what you need for a business pro forma to tell if a project is going to work is the numbers. It's not the pretty rendering, unfortunately. But that's really the truth. So knowing that we could create this all in numbers, then an algorithm seemed like the right approach. So we broke that down into the 5 main what we call buckets, as you see here, the 5 main things that impact it: floor plate design, building form, and so on. And then we weighted those in accordance to how much they impact the pro forma of the project. So is it something that's expensive to fix, that's going to be weighted heavily, or is it something that adds real value? Can you create the perfect unit size of the perfect proportion? Well, that adds value. That's going to be weighted heavily in the other direction. And then there's a few bullet points here with some other things that we're looking at. There's about 150 different aspects of the building that gets reviewed and calculated through the algorithmic approach. The first one of those, of course, is location. So we took the kind of metrics that residential brokers use when they're trying to sell you a house or a condo, and we brought those into the algorithm. So where is it? Will people pay a premium to live there? Is it close to transit? Is it walkable to amenities? Is there restaurants? Are there restaurants? And so on. So obviously that favors buildings in high quality downtown locations with good access to transit. And they're the ones that are going to obviously rent for or sell for more. Where it gets clever from a kind of architecture point of view is when it starts to look at floor plates. So we take a typical floor plate of the building, we measure off the area, the quarter window depth, and so on. And then the algorithm can say, okay, well, you've got 60 feet quarter window, and we know that in your market, the average unit size is going to be 600 square feet. So that's a 60 foot by 10 foot unit, and that's terrible. That's going to score really poorly. By contrast, maybe you've got 35 feet, and the algorithm will say, okay, well, that's 5 feet for a corridor, 30 feet of unit. It's going to be 20, 22 feet wide. That's a perfect 1-bed unit for that market. Great. That's going to score quite highly. All of that is then graded on a bell curve from like absolutely perfect for the market to, unworkable in either direction. But as it's doing that, in a kind of course, work out the number of units you'll have on the floor, and therefore the number of units in the building, can make an estimation of floor plate efficiency, And once it knows the number of units, can work out the parking ratio, the elevator ratio, whether you have enough service risers and so on. All of that being based on the kind of metrics of the project. And of course, we vary that by city. So, what's acceptable in New York, where you don't need parking or loading, is going to be very different to a building we put in Houston, for example, which might have a 1.2 parking space per unit ratio that you need. So it's kind of super site specific as we go through it. And we then, of course, do the same for the envelope. Do you need to completely replace it? And I'll show you an example of that in a second. Do you just need to replace out the windows, or maybe do an overcladding, as we've done at 160 Water Street in New York? Or can you just leave it? And we're actually finding some heritage buildings where you already have the operable windows and it works pretty well. We're doing that because it impacts cost, of course. So looking at that. And then the same for the servicing, the parking, the structure, is it steel, is it concrete, is it post-tension? All of that really impacts the cost of the projects. That all gets factored in to our analysis. So here's what it looks like. I'll jump out of here, and you should be able to now see the kind of standard form. We kept this super simple. The idea was that you needed, if we were going to do 14 million square feet in a couple of weeks, we needed a simple input. Ask you all the questions about the buildings, kind of 30 questions in here. All of that information we should be able to get, or you should be able to provide from a broker's leasing package or from CoStar. So very easy to get the data to plug into here. That then goes into our huge data set, and there's now 960 something buildings in the data set, which continues kind of aggregating and improving. Then runs the calculations, and it goes into our lookup table. Now, the lookup table is the statistics of the perfect Goldilocks residential building, depending on the city. So it's always running this comparison. Basically, how close are the bones of your office building to the bones of a perfect residential building that you could, the most perfect building you could design? And what's the comparison there? Where do you have problems? Where do you have benefits? Now, because the spreadsheet is kind of horrible to look at, it comes out into this dashboard, so you can see every building we've studied so far. There's 960 buildings that we've looked at, and most of those have honestly been over the last 9 months as it's really ramped up. And a green dot on here represents a building that will be financially viable right now. So if you own that building, you've got a really good shot without abatements, without heritage tax credits or whatever, a good chance of making that project work. An orange dot is a building that is kind of a maybe. So it could work if you're in a really good location. So you'll see there's a lot of orange dots in New York, for example. Orange dots in New York are great. The cost of residential is so high there, or the value of residential is so high, you're probably going to make that work. And a red dot is walk away, it's not going to happen. Now, as we've done this, we've really kind of come to understand that across generally the market, about 25% of buildings are viable for conversion. About another 5% are in that kind of orange maybe category. There's a lot more in New York, and I can kind of get into the reasons of that, but less green, more orange in New York. And then, 70% are in the not going to happen category. So I'm always asked, do you think we'll be able to convert every office building? Does it work for every office building? The simple answer is no. It works for about 30% of buildings. But when you think about it, that's all. It doesn't even need to work for that many. We need to do about 10% of office buildings to completely change the office landscape and the housing landscape as well. So being able to identify those buildings in a couple of hours rather than several months of due diligence is really what we've been able to do very effectively. Of course, there's 960 buildings in here. I'll kind of pick one as an example. This is a project quite near to where I am in Toronto, and I'm going to show you what this building now looks like. But it's scored 81%. Above 80 is a pretty good score, definitely viable. The algorithm predicted 98 units in the building, which was actually pretty much bang on. About 80,000 square feet of leasable space, and a saving of between 2.5 and 3.5 million kilograms of carbon equivalent. That's just based on the saving of the embodied carbon that's in there using some UN numbers. You're actually now able to borrow from Department of Energy and others against this. So if you wanted to borrow at a low interest rate for construction. We can provide you with the kilograms of carbon saving and be able to borrow against it. In Canada, you can actually get a grant against it, which is kind of cool. So you're not even borrowing money, you just get it for free. The algorithm then points out a few things. So saying this building scored a 6 on floor plate. Well, I actually know that's because the floor plate is a little bit small. I'll show you what we did about that. Form is perfect. The building is perfectly rectangular. And has windows on all sides. So that's great. 5 on servicing. That's actually because this building has 0 parking, which in Toronto is a bit of a problem, but not a major problem. And it has no loading. Context and envelope are a 9, needs window replacement, and it's right on transit, but it's not right in downtown, so it's suffering a little bit there. This is a kind of way above average building. So how do we determine that? Well, the first projects we did were all in Calgary, but we've now done 900 buildings that aren't in Calgary. But this is what it starts to show. So this is one of the example projects. Bantrell Tower scored 85% in our system. And we took it to the next stage. So the stage after the algorithm is to do a test fit, or what we call a yield study, which gives you all the stats for the project. Again, no kind of pretty design work, just the bones of what you need to price the building. And you can start to see that it basically, with a score of 85, lays out like a residential building. It's great floor plate efficiency at 83%. And you've got the flexibility there to have, studios or 2 beds. The corners work for 2 beds or 1 beds or 3 beds. So really nice, looks like a residential building, not a problem. By contrast, this one scores 63. It's actually just down the street from the other project. Scores 63%. And you can see we took this one to a yield study just out of interest, honestly. But the floor plate efficiency is too low. Like, this is never going to financially work with a 77% floor plate efficiency. And the quarter window depth means that actually these units are oversized and they're too narrow. So these really don't meet the market. You can see how bad the bedrooms are there against the glazing. So this project would never work. So if I score a building now and see it's 63, I'll just tell the client, unfortunately, you need to sell or walk away from this one. And then just to show the kind of fine grain that we're getting to, this building scores 82. And you can see from the floor plate that it works. It's got a good floor plate efficiency, but that extra 3% is really about the flexibility. This building is not as flexible. We have to have more studios. We've got to do larger units on the corners because of the exit stairs. So the algorithm is starting to pick that up. So here's some projects for everyone who says, this doesn't work. We're here to, show you that it can and does. This is one St. Clair. So it's the project I showed you the scorecard of earlier. It's a 12-story, built in the 60s office building, late 60s. Had a weird 80s postmodern expansion on it, which we won't talk about. But the scorecard said the floor plate's too small. And actually, we've been trying to figure out with the client what to do with this building for about 3 years before we came up with the scorecard idea. Doing lobby upgrades and all that kind of stuff didn't work. So ran the scorecard, said the floor plate was too small. We went back to them and said, hey, you guys should just buy these 2 retail units next to it. And they said, sure. So they bought the 2 retail units, made the floor plate bigger. So you can see the expanded floor plate now, about 50 feet of extra space on the building to get a decent floor plate size, to get a good efficient number of units on there. And then in doing that, we thought, well, actually this building is pretty close to the property line. It's pretty big. It makes a really good podium. Why don't we go up? So we've gone up and we're adding 37 stories to the roof of the 12-story building. So it's now a 49-story tower and residential tower amenity on the top of the stack there. And this is what we submitted for zoning recently. So it's showing retained office. It's not, there's still some zoning issues in Toronto. So that will be changed later on. But a good 12-story podium of the existing building and the residential over that works incredibly well. And what's great about this is that you can buy right now a 12-story office building for less than you can buy a development site in most cities. So if you buy an office building and do an overbuild like this, then you're really going to be able to do well on it and make a lot of money. The other thing is it actually allowed us to over-densify the site because we didn't have to do the setbacks that are required of new buildings. because it was an existing building there. So there is a 2-meter setback, or a 6 feet-ish for everyone else setback. And typically you'd have to do a 6-meter setback on a new site here. So really kind of helps squeeze the maximum value out of the site. This is in for city approvals right now, and takes a really interesting structural approach of basically interweaving 2 buildings into the same location. So they're structurally almost independent from each other. And I think, Boots the other day said it's like a 12-story foundation to a tower. It kind of is. There's 12 stories of structure coming through the existing building to support the tower separately, but allowed us to maintain much of the existing structure, maintain the existing carbon in there, and create something really new and flexible on top. Great views as well. And this is the amenity space, but you can actually see here the additional structure we added. So there's off-grid columns, which is, the one right in the middle here, that support the structure above. And that avoided us having to reinforce the existing columns or try and underpin the existing footings, because we just avoid them and create new footings, new columns instead. For those of you interested, my office is just there in downtown. So here's a more simple conversion, because I know that in places that I also work, like Washington, DC, the idea of doing a 49-story tower is a complete pipe dream. So this is a more typical conversion. This is finished about 1.5 years ago in Philadelphia, Franklin Tower, completely vacant 70s office building, about 24,000 square foot floor plate, converted over to 100% residential. Actually, the original intention was to keep some of it as office, but that ended up not happening. It's now fully residential. And you can see some of the things we did. Complete reclad on this one, added operable windows in, improved the glazing, improved the energy performance. And then we actually pushed the facade back to create balconies on the ends and on the corners. And that gave us a little bit of GFA saving, we were then able to use to build a nice penthouse. This just has a 1-story penthouse, which I'll show you, but actually, on another project, 160 Water Street, we cored out the middle of the building where we couldn't use it and use that GFA to build a 5-story penthouse. So lots of options here to squeeze the most value out of the building. But as you can see, it basically looks like a residential building. Big kind of fat residential building, but looks like a residential building, and lays out like one as well.
Office building built. You said that was
it's like 72, I think.
All right, okay, 70.
Yeah,
that's an office building that no one would want, but it looked like a phenomenal multi-family project.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually something that we're seeing a lot. Honestly, though, the buildings from the late 60s, early 70s are really prime for this. And there are a few reasons. They generally had a bit of a shallower quarter window depth, just as was the style then. The other thing is that they're coming up to 50, 55 years old. And if they haven't been reinvested in, which a lot of them haven't, everything in that building is end of life. The facade on this building leaked like a sieve. It wasn't airtight. All of the mechanical systems were shot. They were 50 years old, inefficient. They weren't working properly. So the owner either had to invest a huge amount of money to upgrade this and keep it as an office building with almost no chance of finding a tenant, or they could reinvest and make it a residential building. And that's the buildings we're seeing now, is those buildings that require a huge amount of reinvestment, which is driving down their value, because no one's going to put in $50 to $100 million into this building to try and attract a tenant that is just going to go to a new building, across the street. So that's the kind of prime candidates, honestly, is those buildings, the buildings you never would have wanted to buy pre-COVID, because, they're a money pit, and now the ones that you can get for a really good deal and completely reinvest in. So you can see about 38-foot quarter window depth here, laid out really nicely for residential units. The client actually decided to do a mix. So you're seeing some buried bedrooms with large living spaces and, great for entertaining. And then you're seeing next to that a unit of about the same size with a bedroom on the glass and a smaller living space. So it really kind of gave you the choice as a tenant here. Did you want to take a unit with a big living space, or a unit with a window in the bedroom? You can also see on the ends where we pushed in the balconies just to shallow up the quarter window depth at the end, which was identified by the algorithm as being a problem. Obviously, And then what was the core space in the middle where the washrooms were and the kind of floor plate amenities, we completely demoed out and we converted that to on-floor amenity space. So instead of having one big amenity floor in the building, there's distributed amenities throughout the stack, and that helped us get the overall building efficiency up. And I'll show you some of those in a second. But this building is kind of unusual that the elevators are facing away from each other at opposite ends of the building. And we would have had an option here if I was doing this building in New York or San Francisco or another high value market. We could have actually cut this out, created a blind shaft in the middle and added more density to the roof, but it doesn't quite pencil out in the lower value markets. So this is what those spaces look like. Each floor has slightly different amenities. So we've got some kids play areas, we've got some co-working spaces. But the nice thing about distributing them like this is it makes the residents feel like there's a lot of amenity space, but actually they're relatively small and intimate, so people are more encouraged to use them. And the total amenity offering is not higher than it would be if you did an amenity floor. We also found that during COVID, there was the ability to kind of switch some of these out if we wanted to, because they're smaller spaces with less investment. And the kids' play areas have been super popular because you can take your kids and put them there while you're trying to work from home, and no one can hear them when they're between the concrete walls of the elevators. So this is what those units look like. And the other thing I heard actually this morning, and I've heard previously as well, is that these buildings, once you convert them, are not going to be as valuable as, well, the rent's not going to be the same as a ground up residential. What we've actually found is the rent is higher, and a big driver of that is the ceiling heights that you get. So typical residential might be built at 9 foot 8 or 10 feet floor to floor. You get a 9-foot ceiling. Well, these office buildings, even the worst ones like this and the one I showed you at St. Clair, were built with a much higher floor to floor. So we're getting, in this instance, 10-foot-6 ceilings. We're having the ability to embed new MEP into the ceilings and do a drop bulkhead under the washrooms and bathroom and kitchens to deal with the plumbing. So creating really good, really high top of market residential for about 30% less than a residential ground up building would cost to do. And this one has some great ground floor amenity space as well. This is what used to be some parking entry and loading and retail and lobbies converted into a nice basketball court. It's actually open to the community on the weekends for events. And then what was the penthouse, mechanical penthouse, we've added a bit of space to it. Also hugely shrunk the penthouse because we're able to distribute a lot of that MEP into the units themselves and create this great rooftop space. So as you can see, these pictures were taken just before construction was finished. There's a scissor lift there and some maintenance equipment outside, but create a really good space up there that's really popular. And it's one of the tallest buildings in the city, so it gets great views out over the neighborhood as well.
Now, as a kind of about the leasing on that, I found that pretty interesting. So how do the rents compare in this versus everywhere else, and how quickly did it get? Is it fully leased? I'll speed up for you.
Yeah, I mean, it is fully, or it was originally fully leased. You can go on their website and you can see which units are up for rent right now. There's not many available in there. They're way over 90% leased, and they're getting a higher rate than any other building in the city. So it's, I hate to comment on it because every time you go on there, it's got more expensive. It's kind of interesting to see how much a studio unit is and stuff. It's a really good comparison, because they are getting top rates, and they're getting top rates because the units are incredible. They're super high, the amenities are good, and that's a good reason for it. And this is what we call a kind of mid to high end product. We're also doing projects which are super high end which is super high end product, because you've got that ceiling height. You can see projects. Unfortunately, not one of my projects, but Amman in New York converted an office building to hotel and luxury residential, and those units start at $50 million. And if you want a swimming pool, they're $80 million. And that's an office conversion. Same with One Wall Street in New York, super high-end luxury product, taking advantage of those ceiling heights, taking advantage of the incredible banking hall and lobby that was already on the ground floor, and the heritage appeal of that building. So we're really aiming most of these in that kind of upper portion of the market and really achieving the rents and sales out of that as well. Uh, this is another good example. This is, wanted to show on a kind of more secondary or tertiary city. This is Rivermark Centre in Baton Rouge. And believe it or not, this is the after image. So before conversion, it looked like this building. After conversion, it looks like this. And the reason for that is that the facade here is actually structural, which is a really problem I've never seen before and hopefully won't ever see again. But a structurally facaded cast in place concrete building. And we're able to cut away some of the gaps, so you can see some of the facade cut away on the corners here. And we're actually able to maintain an office tenant in the bottom 5 floors. So Chase has 5 floors in here. They maintained signage rights on the top of the building, which is a bit weird, honestly, for a residential building. But it's not the most glamorous thing. It looks like a brutalist, a kind of 60s office building is now residential. But the floor plan works really well. It's a tight floor plan. The units are almost perfectly square for the 1-beds, which is great. We pushed some balconies in, got really good floor plate efficiency out of it, and about 145 units in the building. Now, this is what it looks like on the outside, but look what it looks like on the inside. Taking advantage of the really great ceiling heights. We're at 13 feet down the side of the soffit in here. Exposed to the existing concrete. It's a kind of interesting structural system. And these look like renderings are actually photographs of the finished building. It's done and occupied now. Just really nice set dressing. But you can see how incredible the space is and why these are now commanding premium rents.
Yeah, one thing that I want to highlight there is you created more window line through those interior patios than
absolutely.
And then there's this concept of sort of borrowed light, and I know too, people are probably looking at this and they're seeing bedrooms that don't have windows. So kind of addressing the way of getting light to the bedrooms, and then the code the ways you guys are dealing with the code around that too. If you can make sure you can touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. This by pushing the glazing back here, we're actually able to turn what was a smaller opening into a larger amount of glazing, get the return there as well, so you get a lot of natural light in. And then the concrete, kind of structural concrete, becomes part of the upstand for the guard for the balcony. But what looks like kind of tiny windows on the outside are actually pretty good. They're pretty big. If this was a house, it'd be bigger than most glazing in most houses, and really nice units. And then where we were able to make some cutaways on the facade, on the corners, we created these terraces just to take advantage of a really incredible view out over the river. So a really nice way of achieving a really nice, high quality, very desirable product in a building that had no one desired as an office. And a pool on the roof lined up with the core, so we didn't have to structurally reinforce too much, but adding a great amenity to it as well. So getting into that kind of idea of what we do from a code point of view with different unit layouts. This is a building in Calgary, one of the first ones we looked at. And this is what it looked like as an office. So all cellular offices, pretty old fashioned, kind of weird, but nice tight core. And we laid it out for a couple of different unit approaches. The first one was to do typical market units. And we found that as we did that, we started to have some issues with some bedrooms on the glazing, but some buried bedrooms. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And a pretty good floor plate efficiency, but some of the units were kind of oversized and had a few issues. So we'll typically do this when we do a test fit case study. We'll say, what does it look like at the market? What does it look like skewed towards student housing and so on, and help our clients figure out which one is most valuable to them. But one of the interesting things you can see here, which is allowed in Calgary and not in other markets, is this kind of bedroom here with a corner missing. Now, what that actually looks like is this. So it's that idea of borrowed light. And you can, if you have guests over, you can slide these doors shut. They're kind of frosted glass. You slide the doors shut and no one can see a messy bedroom. And then if you're laying in bed on a Sunday morning, you can pull those open and get a lot of natural light in. Now, this is completely allowable in Calgary, Toronto, and a bunch of other places. In other instances, like the work we're doing in New York, that would be called, you'd have a bedroom potentially on the glass, and then the second bedroom like this would be called a home office or a walk-in wardrobe or whatever. And we're seeing studios with buried bedrooms as well. So just depending on where you are, what market you're in, how you deal with that, how what you do with borrowed light versus ventilation versus code changes a little bit. But there's always that option actually to create more bedrooms and more buried space if you need to. Of course, our algorithm favors buildings where you don't have to do that because the value of them is still higher. But this is that same floor plate actually focused on smaller units. So this is a student housing type approach. We're seeing a lot of these buildings skewing towards student housing right now because there's a big need for that. And also, a lot of these buildings, if you can squeeze more units in, you can up the value of them as well. So this is all what we'd call micro units or studios at 200, just under 230 square feet each. But there's again some tricks to how to deal with this. So this studio has a kind of fancy version of a Murphy bed. And working with a company called RRA, we actually, been using this product where the bed lifts up into the ceiling and disappears. So it leaves a couch underneath. So rather than folding up and all the stuff falling off of it, being a mess, it just lifts straight up, disappears, and actually takes advantage of the fact.
Steven, on my bed, actually, I rigged it because I didn't have much space. Rigged it so when you got out of bed, it floated to the ceiling. So
Perfect. Yeah,
they need help on that. But
one of the things I find really funny about this RA system is you can control it from your phone. So if you've had a rough day at work and you just want to go straight to bed, you can, on your commute home, you can tell it to put the bed down, set it up. So it's kind of fun, but it takes advantage of that extra ceiling height that we have in these office conversions to just kind of tuck the bed up out of the way. And if we get it right, we can tuck it between the beams and just like completely disappears. But a cool system. There's a lot of these. Your bed. Yeah, I mean, this one's nicely made, but yeah, it does automatically shut off if it starts going up and you've left either yourself or something else on the bed too. So they're pretty cool space saving systems for these types of projects. But the standard units, look really nice. Again, nice ceilings. I know these units look small, but remember they're in markets where tiny units are pretty common. So be able to create something really special out of them. And then really special amenity space with a great roof terrace out there as well.
So we've got a question from Mark, and he's asking, when you're typically doing these conversions, what are the most expensive or intensive components to consider? And he has, you hear the plumbing thing a lot. I know we talked about it, but waste lines, HVAC zones, asbestos. But why don't you start with the plumbing, because that's the one that I hear the most, and you can kind of tackle the others.
Yeah, the plumbing's an interesting one because everyone says that, but if you're doing a ground up residential building, you have to deal with distributed plumbing anyway. So you've got the same problem you'd have in ground up. And typically what we're seeing, or one of two approaches, one is to core drill through and treat it like you would a ground up residential building. The other is to core drill and actually use some of that height, and you saw it on the Franklin Tower project where there's the bulkheads, use some of that height to run the drainage from the unit above to connect it to all the other drains and do a single stack, either a single new stack, or if in a lot of instances, you can get it back to the core of the building and run down the existing risers to minimize the number of and size of core drills you've got to do. On the MEP side, we're seeing some MEP reuse, and that one in Calgary, they're actually reusing they're putting new radiant heaters around the outside, but maintaining the pipe system. But you can actually approach these buildings in a much more sustainable way by using what you typically do in a passive house building. So in a typical residential building, everything gets vented out through the facade. The fresh air comes in freezing cold to every single unit, and that's it. Or freezing cold if you're in Toronto like me, and boiling hot if you're somewhere else. But in a passive house building and in an office building, you don't do that. You centralize all of the air intake and extract, and that allows you to do things like adding heat recovery, both to heat hot and cold recovery from the air, to do a dedicated outdoor air system, to do heat recovery from shower and other black water, and make a super sustainable building out there. So we are seeing a lot of people go that route because you're able to do it with the ceiling height, with the central mechanical rooms, with the central chiller plant that we can reuse on the roof. The biggest hits in terms of cost, there's really two things: asbestos, and even if the building says it doesn't have asbestos in it, it has asbestos in it somewhere, and we're finding that buildings that have been certified as clean aren't clean, and that's a major issue. We actually trawl through all of the existing drawings and highlight anywhere that the original drawing says there's asbestos, as insulation, as planning, as whatever, and we highlight that as somewhere to go back to. And the other thing on the West Coast especially is seismic, and that's actually making the West Coast projects more of a challenge, and that's why you're seeing New York and Toronto and Boston and so on being successful with these projects. It can be a kind of $10 to $15 million seismic upgrade to do a project on the West Coast, which is really challenging. So we're working with cities over there now to relax the rules around that, based on the fact that an office building has a density of about one person for every 100 square feet. A residential building is about one for every 400 to 500 square feet. So we're actually reducing the risk by reducing the number of people in the building, and therefore getting some kind of dispensation on the other code issues. And that's great because we already have that with exit stairs and so on, because we have less people. We need less exit stairs. You need less air and water and so on. But we're working with them on maintaining life safety, but reducing the huge requirements of seismic upgrades. But they're the two costs that we really have to think about early on. Is the building full of asbestos? Does it need a seismic upgrade? If not, then we're about 30% cheaper than ground up construction, and that's great. And we can move ahead pretty safely.
Great. There's another question from Kevin about conversion time frame for the interior demo. What should be considered, and then in comparison to ground up sort of site prep.
Yeah, the nice thing about this, what's actually driving the schedules, is not being able to get enough trades right now. But you can, in theory, do demo on every single floor all at once and start and redoing it. We're seeing about 3 weeks-ish per floor for demo and fit out. That's not to say you can start and finish a floor in 3 weeks. That's aggregated across the whole building. But that is significantly quicker than what you're seeing for ground up construction. What I really like about it is you can start straight away. You can start putting finishes in. You can start stripping out. You're generally watertight immediately. And my typical ground up residential projects, it's like 5 months of digging a hole and then 6 months of building up from that hole to get back to ground level, when you might be a year into a project and you'll have just peaked above your starting point. So you don't have any of that. You're just really moving straight ahead with it. So somewhere around 3 weeks per floor. The 21-story one in Baton Rouge took about 14 months to do. 160 Water Street, which is 28 stories, I think, it's just about to finish. That's been about 16 months to do it, including the demo and strip out and a seismic upgrade and an overclad. But you have the advantage, if you can get enough people there, you have the advantage of being able to tackle every floor all at the same time. And I've never seen a site as busy as the one at 160 Water Street. It's insane. We've got 300 people on site at any one time.
And Stephen, Mike has another question. Just back of the envelope, if you were going to say, when estimating additional cost per square foot, what do you think this is on average? Kind of, I know you've got a lot of pricing movement in trades and commodities, and cities are priced differently. But you brought up that $75 a square foot extra, sort of in Calgary.
Yeah.
How should we think about that, like in other cities in the United States?
It varies so.
Like
it varies so massively based on city, and honestly, to a point where I was pretty shocked. You can build out these projects at about 150 to 200 a square foot in Calgary. So the $75 is coming to about half the cost.
You mean convert, right?
Yeah, convert them. You do it in New York, it's 600 to 1,000. So the number we've been using is, if you know what it costs to do ground up residential, take 25 to 30% off of that in your market is the best way to work out what it will as an average is what it would cost. But we've been working with people like Turner Construction and Structure Tone and some others to actually take our algorithm output, and they run it through a cost model localized to your city, and they will give you a ROM costing, in a day, essentially. So that's a good way of doing it as well, because as I've been doing this, and we've done 960 now, the cost variation by location is 4 times as much to build it in New York as it cost in Houston, kind of thing. And different quality of product as well, but different labor rules, different construction costs, different schedules. It's all, the variation is kind of crazy.
And so obviously hazmat has play into that. Kevin's asking, do you have any numbers or ideas on, hazmat, how out of control that can get in terms of like asbestos remediation? Is it big enough to be a deal breaker, or what does that add price per square foot in general, if you have any sort of idea?
No, the asbestos remediation has not been a deal breaker on any of them yet. It's only the seismic upgrades that have. We're on the projects that we've done so far, somewhere between 50,000 and 1.5 million for a asbestos abatement, depending on the size of the building. A couple of dollars a square foot, I guess it would work out to. But it's never been a deal breaker. The one thing that is, and this is why we always go back through existing drawings, the one thing that is killer is thinking that you're clean of asbestos and then you're not, and you have to shut everything down. So we've started to become really diligent on knowing where the asbestos is, knowing where, how that affects the existing structure. And in particular, this is super specific, but the gap between the edge of the slab and the cladding, no one has ever taken the asbestos out of there. And the second you start trying to redo some work on the facade, you're going to find it. Even if the building says it's clean, there's definitely some there. So knowing that ahead of time so that we're not shutting the whole site down to deal with it is kind of key. But a lot of lessons learned from doing a bunch of these projects in terms of where asbestos is hiding and how you get to it.
Well, Stephen, we're over time. So I want to thank you so much for your generosity in joining us for this quarterly conversation. I know we have so many questions. For those that want to follow up with Stephen Paetner, you can find him on LinkedIn or at Gensler. Welcome to contact us. We can also give you his email. Your email is, Stephen, if you wouldn't mind just giving it real quickly.
Yeah, I'll flash it back up on screen. It's Stephen_Painter at Gensler.com, but you can see it. I'm also very easy to Google.
Awesome.
So feel free to screen grab that or reach out.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, I hope you stay really busy and look forward to solving the housing problem by also solving the office problem. So sounds like a win-win.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks very much,
everyone, for joining us today. And if you guys have any questions about RRA as well, happy to answer those too. So thanks, everyone. Have a good one.